a response to a hateful and offensive video.
The video and its influence on the protests that occurred in Cairo and Benghazi in response to this video. It was the video that caused the unrest in Cairo, that precipitated some of the unrest in Benghazi. It was sparked by the reaction to this video. The video was a precipitating cause to the unrest, specifically in Libya. Might take advantage of a situation that was brought about initially as a response to the video in question.
Natural protests that arose because of the outrage over the video.
You're totally correct that they spent 2 weeks telling us this was about a tape and that there was this riot outside the Benghazi consulate, which there wasn't.
Natural protests that arose because of the outrage over the video.
I was in chronic pain, and my family struggling to make ends meet, food and gas prices going up, even keeping my job was iffy. Then I learned about a new miracle drug made in Washington, D.C., Spenditol. Spenditol is Washington's answer to all the painful problems Americans face. How to borrow $800 billion for a stimulus that didn't create jobs or fix the economy? Spenditol.
Spenditol is not for everyone. Side effects may include a mountain of government debt piled on our kids, a sudden loss of freedoms, higher prices for everything, leaving our kids a lesser America than we had. Ask your doctor or congressman if your conscience is strong enough for Spenditol.
And it's so popular in Washington, we have to import trillions more of it from China. Spenditol makes you feel better now and pushes off the really bad stuff till later, for them to deal with.
Call the White House and Congress. Tell them, stop spending it all.
And welcome back into the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the Conservative Broadcast Media Network. I'm your host, Jim Lee. Thanks for being with us tonight. As we roll through hour one here, I think one of the consistent themes you're going to hear is not only taking on the cacistocracy, but you're going to hear about ineptocracy as well. Because if you're a longtime listener to the Palmetto Conservative Show, you've heard me make the very same argument I'm about to discuss by former Republican Senator from Florida, George Lemieux. But it is an example of precisely what is wrong with big government and precisely what is wrong with people who have skills and perspectives that are not in keeping with the solutions that they supposedly espouse. He's saying, what the heck are you talking about, Jim? Well, let me explain. Back when I ran for Congress in 2010, one of the things that I am most proud of in the course of all that was a willingness to step onto the third rail of politics. And it wasn't because I was so forward-thinking as to know that we were approaching the entitlement problems that we are today. This would go back into the 2008-2009 time frame, but rather we knew precisely that that was the problem. It had been talked about for many, many years. The Band-Aid that was put in place back in the Reagan administration was just that. It was a Band-Aid. And the things that were done by various Congresses and presidents since Ronald Reagan took what was supposed to have been a much longer-term solution and made it a much shorter-term solution, which is to confirm the government axiom that if it's possible to take something that's a mess and make it worse, there's a government program for that. But when I campaigned, it was clear at the time that between Medicare and Medicaid, there was between $80 and $120 billion worth of fraud, waste, and abuse every year in those systems. So in looking for ways in order to rein in spending, ways to save taxpayers' money, I did propose, looking for possible efficiencies. Going back to, again, the Reagan administration, there was a commission, I believe it was the Grace Commission, that at that time had identified an inordinate sum of money that was basically government waste year in and year out. And back in Reagan's time, I believe the number was somewhere in the 300 and some million dollars a year, which, if you'll remember back in Reagan's day, that was still real money. And one can imagine, since none of the recommendations of the Grace Commission were ever implemented, which is another key aspect of the kakistocracy. They will promote to study some issue and supposedly come up with recommendations, but they'll never do anything with them. In fairness, the same is true with many companies in the private sector, but at least in the private sector, if they go out of business, it's their problem and not the government. But anyway, $80 to $120 billion in fraud, waste, and abuse that if we would simply have the political courage and the common sense and the will to actually do something meaningful, money could be saved. And I talked about at the time taking $1 billion or $2 billion and spending it on a full-fledged analysis, bringing in some of the best minds, paying the top dollars from the private sector for people who do Lean Six Sigma and other process optimization skills to facilitate an up and down review of the process of the delivery and payment of services under Medicare and Medicaid. And then closing all of the loopholes and shortcomings, thus saving anywhere from $78 to $118 billion in the first year. That, for those of you that don't follow business closely, would be a tremendous return on investment. But, as is typically the case with government, very rarely is the return on investment anywhere near what it should be. So, former Senator Lemieux, in an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal, talks about lots of talk and little action on Medicare fraud. The president, during his re-election campaign, that made claims that he had pursued, quote, fraud in Medicare and Medicaid very aggressively, more aggressively than ever before. Mr. Lemieux says America's seniors deserve to know the truth behind this misleading assertion. The Obama administration could be doing far more to protect seniors who rely on the Medicare and Medicaid programs and to protect taxpayers whose dollars are wasted by the billions. Behind the flashy press conferences and announcements, the reality is that some administration anti-fraud efforts in those programs are actually losing money, while others are producing few palpable results. Now think about that for just a second, folks. I know you're probably picking yourself up off the ground saying, no, that's not possible. That would never happen. The government implementing programs that don't actually work or are losing money or don't actually produce the results for which they were established? But that's exactly the case. Some 48 million Americans depend on Medicare for health coverage, yet the program is threatened by waste, fraud, and abuse. Barry Rand, the CEO of AARP, editorial note, I'm not a fan of AARP, so that I'm using information that refers to them tells you how bad it really is. Barry Rand, the CEO of AARP, estimates that Medicare and Medicaid lose up to $100 billion per year because of systemic weaknesses in the programs. Now, for those of you who don't speak government speak, systemic weaknesses in the programs can be translated in very simple terms. Inefficient bureaucracy. Inefficient bureaucracy. Systemic weaknesses. The processes are poorly defined, poorly designed, they're bureaucratic, there's tons of overhead, tons of supposed oversight, little return on investment. These weaknesses are one reason that the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, has repeatedly designated Medicare a quote-unquote high-risk program in need of reform. We talk about immigration being in need of reform, and yet I'm still waiting for people to tell me exactly what about immigration policy needs to be reformed. I know what about immigration policy needs to be enforced, but I digress. Here's a case where you have the GAO, the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office, repeatedly telling us that this program is in need of reform. And this is not new news. We've heard it for quite some time. For too long, Medicare's anti-fraud efforts have been based on a pay and chase system under which bills are paid and then law enforcement has to chase down the claimants of inaccurate or dishonestly obtained payments. This is a recipe for disaster, since the federal government will never recapture even a fraction of the money unwittingly sent to crooks and fraudsters. A much better approach is to stop inaccurate payments from being sent out. That would be to stop it at the point of origin. Mr. Lemieux continues, when I was in the U.S. Senate, I wrote a provision to the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010 that could dramatically improve Medicare's anti-fraud efforts. The provision requires Medicare to use a, quote, fraud protection system, unquote, to screen claims so that the riskier claims get a closer look before the bills are paid. The approach would be akin to banks and credit card companies using sophisticated analytics technology to, quote unquote, predict which payments may be at risk of falling into the wrong hands, but doing so before they are paid. This change to Medicare's anti-fraud efforts enjoyed bipartisan support from lawmakers when the law was passed by Congress. However, here's where it gets good, because this is textbook Federal Government 101 when it comes to execution. However, despite the president's tough talk, his administration may be jeopardizing the success of this common-sense provision. First, bureaucrats at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, that would be MMS, awarded $77 million in 2011 to contractors Northrop Grumman and Verizon to implement the fraud prevention system. Let that waft in the air for just a second. When I say to you Verizon, what's the first thing that comes to mind to you? Of course, the most 4G networks in the world. In America, excuse me. Cell phone plans, data share plans across many devices, a family plan. And how about Northrop Grumman? If you're a good defense hawk like me, first thing that comes to mind is defense contractor. Planes, guided missiles, radar systems, you name it. But the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which last I checked have nothing to do with cell phones, because I believe the free Obamacare phones come from the Health and Human Services. No, I don't think that's right either. I'm not really sure what agency oversees the distribution of the free Obamacare cell phones, but I digress. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services awarded $77 million to Northrop Grumman and Verizon to implement the fraud protection system. Unfortunately, the contractor's primary area of expertise isn't in predictive analytics technologies, which help alert to fraud, but rather in defense and telecommunications.